Hi, everyone. So today we are going to discuss performance management in this particular module. So this basically builds off of what we did last week, where we talked about understanding what was and wasn't considered to be part of our performance domain or our criterion that we were interested in. So this lecture will largely focus on some of the issues in appraising, or rather assessing, performance, and we will touch on some things like biases in decision making that would impact that process. Okay, so what is performance management? According to the textbook, it's a system of performance monitoring, assessment, or improvement, and improvement. And it's based on a system that involves setting goals for performance, getting coaching on achieving those goals, getting feedback on not achieving those goals or achieving those goals. It also involves, therefore, the appraisal of performance, so the actual assessment of whether people are performing their jobs, and then developmental planning. So based on the feedback that you get, planning for change, planning for development, planning to achieve a certain level of performance. So within this lecture, what we will be focusing on largely as part of that performance management process is the performance appraisal aspect. The purposes of performance appraisal are multitudinous. So you have personnel decisions are based on your performance appraisals. So without understanding how employees are performing, you can't make promotion decisions, or rather you probably shouldn't make promotion decisions until you know how people are performing. And then termination decisions as well. You can't make decisions about who to fire and who to keep if you don't have any idea how your employees are performing. There are also some other beneficial purposes for performance appraisal, like I mentioned earlier, developmental purposes. So training, you can use performance appraisal to assess where your employees might need development and might need intervention. It doesn't mean that they're worth getting fired over, but you would do this, for example, with new employees, assess where maybe they didn't quite meet all of the marks that you had in your job description, and then train them on what they're missing. Documentation is also a critical part of the performance appraisal process, or rather, it's a critical outcome of the performance appraisal process. The reason it's so critical is that without documentation of performance of your employees, you really open yourself up to the risk of being sued, and successfully being sued from the perspective of the person suing you. So let's take, for example, an accusation of discrimination. Let's say that your company is accused of discriminating in who they hire and fire. Without showing that the people that you've hired and that the people that you've fired are truly the best applicants and the best performers in the case of who you're hiring, and then in terms of who you're firing, they are the worst performers, you fail to meet your burden of proof to show that you did not discriminate. So you may say to yourself, I don't need to keep good track of performance appraisal. I don't need to keep track of whether my employees are up to the task and up to the challenge of their job. You absolutely do, because if your employees are smart and they get fired, they can very easily sue you and win. And if they claim discrimination, or if they claim that they were part of a protected class and that's why they were fired. So if you want to keep yourself relatively safe from legal challenges to your personnel decisions, you need to document everything. So what happens when you have bad performance appraisals? So there's a really interesting piece from the New York Times called Inside Amazon: Wrestling Big Ideas in a Bruising Workplace. And I really recommend reading this. In fact, we're actually going to go and look at a sample from this article to show you what happens when you have bad performance appraisals, and what people can react to when your system is bad. So I'm going to pause this. We're going to go to a different screen. Okay, so here we are at the article. It's a pretty lengthy one, and I really do recommend reading it. Amazon is a very interesting place in terms of assessing how they manage their employees. But here we're going to focus on where performance appraisals can be done poorly and therefore negatively impact employees as well as your public perception. For the record, Amazon has come under a lot of fire for the way it treats its employees and its workers, both temporary and full time, and it's not good for their reputation. And there are a lot of people who have chosen, in response to the way Amazon does things, to not quote unquote feed the beast. And so, because of that, you need to be very careful, especially in this day and age with everybody having a platform to share their experiences. Your former employees could very well share how bad your performance appraisal system is, and that could impact the reputation of your company and of your organization and your ability to recruit good talent in the future. So here it says this, and this is about Amazon's anytime feedback tool, which since this got coverage, it has been changed. This gives you an idea of what a bad performance appraisal system can look like and the negative impact it can have, and therefore why discussing performance management and assessment and performance appraisal is so critical. So the section header says a running competition. In 2013, Elizabeth Willett, a former Army captain who served in Iraq, joined Amazon to manage housewares vendors and was thrilled to find that a large company could feel so energetic and entrepreneurial. After she had a child, she arranged with her boss to be in the office from 7 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. each day, pick up her baby, and often return her laptop later. Her boss assured her things were going well, but her colleagues, who did not see how early she arrived, sent him negative feedback, accusing her of leaving too soon. Boss later went on to say, "I can't stand here and defend you if your peers are saying you're not doing your work," she says he told her. She left the company after a little more than a year. Miss Willett's coworkers strafed her through the Anytime Feedback tool, the widget in the company directory that allows employees to send praise or criticism about colleagues to management. While bosses know who sends the comments, their identities are not typically shared with the subjects of the remarks. Because team members are ranked and those at the bottom eliminated every year, it is in everyone's interest to outperform everyone else. Craig Berman, an Amazon spokesman, said the tool was just another way to provide feedback, like sending an email or walking into a manager's office. Most comments, he said, are positive. However, many workers called it a river of intrigue and scheming. They described making quiet pacts with colleagues to bury the same person at once or to praise one another lavishly. Many others, along with Ms. Willett, described feeling sabotaged by negative comments from unidentified colleagues with whom they could not argue. In some cases, the criticism was copied directly into their performance reviews, a move that Amy Michaels, the former Kindle manager, said that colleagues called the full paste. Soon the tool or something else may be found in many more offices. And so we'll leave it at there, actually. So this gives you an idea of how a bad performance appraisal system, or rather one that's not doing a good job and not actually assessing performance, could impact your employees. This employee who enjoyed her job was seen as being delinquent in her work by her coworkers. Because Amazon rightly used perspectives from different employees, not just supervisors, but also peers, it led to actually some politicking, which we will also cover in today's lecture. So this just goes to show you that not only can it negatively impact your employees when you have a negative and bad performance appraisal system, and it can lead you to lose really good talent and create a toxic work environment. In the case of Amazon, it could also lead you to suffer some reputational damage. So I'm going to pause right here and go back to the PowerPoint, but I really recommend, as I said, reading this whole entire article. So this transitions nicely into one of our first points here, that when you're assessing performance and appraising performance, you can get it from multiple sources. The problem with getting it from any single source is that every source is biased in one way or another. So we could get self-rated performance appraisals. That's not unheard of. You have people rate themselves, and indeed many of you have or will be a part of a company that asks you to rate your own performance. But we are biased. Research consistently shows that we tend to think we are all above average on a lot of things, and statistically speaking, most of us can't be above average. That's the whole statistical concept of being above average. And so we tend to think that we're better at things than we are. I really recommend, if you're interested in understanding how we distort perceptions of ourselves to feed our own ego, to read this really great book called The Curse of the Self. It's written by a Duke psychologist, I believe, a Duke psychology professor. It's really good and really fascinating about how much we overestimate our talents and our abilities. Now, we also can get ratings from other people, like your manager, but managers are also biased. Managers may have their own distaste for certain people. They may not see you working all the time. And we'll discuss later, but managers also engage in political behavior in their performance appraisals and their performance assessments. And finally, we can also have coworkers. But coworkers are also biased. As I just showed you, coworkers can engage in tactics to sabotage you rather than give you accurate performance appraisals. Coworkers have their own biases. And research by Scullin and colleagues show that yes, your performance does figure into your colleagues' ratings of you, but not as much as other factors like when did they see you, how often did they see you, the context in which they saw you, the type of behavior you were performing. So all of us are biased, and any single source that you rely on, any just one source, is going to be biased by itself. One quick thing, though, I do want to acknowledge is it really biased on the point of my ratings of myself? The only person who is with me all the time is me. I know my performance better than anybody else. My supervisor doesn't always catch me working hard at my desk. And some of you may relate to this, this idea of I work really hard, and inevitably the one time I take a break or like step away to look at my phone and watch a video, that's when my supervisor comes in, or that's when my coworker comes in. And so we have to ask ourselves, are some of these biases, or are they just accurate and look like biases? So it's just something to consider, that the individual themselves may be the person who observes all the behaviors and therefore a great observer of the person's performance, but they also may be biased to overinflate their performance and represent it as being better than it actually is. So, in order to avoid the problem of biases stemming from one single source, we have 360-degree feedback. This is where we get feedback from multiple sources who observe performance. And because we get it from multiple sources, it can therefore minimize bias and the idiosyncrasies that show up when we just get information from one source. So, it's beneficial in that way. It's of course time consuming. 360-degree feedback isn't easy, and it takes a lot of time and therefore a lot of money. But your employees will probably be happier if they feel like they're getting ratings from multiple people, especially if those ratings include self-report and self-assessments. Of course, as I said, 360-degree feedback can be very time consuming and therefore very costly. So we have other ways of getting performance appraisals. We can do top down, which is where the supervisor rates the employee. A lot of you are probably familiar with this, and this being the kind of performance ratings that you got when you were working for an organization. The other approach is upward appraisals, so where lower level persons rate the employees. This is what university professors sometimes get, though we actually also get 360-degree feedback. Our feedback isn't just from our students who give us teaching evaluations. We also get rated by our peers and our supervisors. So, but there are places where, for example, you would want to know, or positions where you would want to know how people are treating lower, or how the lower level person appraises that employee. So if you have a manager, you absolutely want to know how they are being rated by their lower level subordinates, because their job is to manage them. So there are just different sources we can rely on to get the information that we need to appraise people. As I said, though, everybody brings their own bias, so you always have to be really careful. Now, there are a bunch of different methods that we can use to get this information. The one that you're probably most familiar with, and the one that you will see in your job the most, is probably graphic rating scales and similar approaches. So those that involve, being given a piece of paper or even an online form and picking a number on a scale from 1 through 5 that best represents the person's the person's performance. There are other approaches. We can have computer adaptive rating scales. This is where we go through a system that gives us statements related to performance, and we basically calibrate. So you're given one statement, and based on how you respond to that, you're given another statement and another. And as they give you basically statements that can describe, two statements usually, that describe your employees, by forcing you to choose, it essentially goes down a decision tree, if you will, and gets us to a point where it calibrates what that employee's performance is. If you're not sure how this works, the current computer adaptive system for the GRE, so the one of the graduate school exams that some of you may take, that's the same thing it's talking about here. The GRE does the same thing now, for the record, and a lot of standardized tests do this now, where you're given a question, and based on whether or not you get it wrong, it then gives you either a harder question or a less hard question. And then as you go through, based on what you get right and wrong, it slowly starts to calibrate where is your score. It's the same with an employee. You're given two statements, and based on what you say, is the employee performing well? Are they not? It starts branching. So if you say this employee is performing well, well, then they give you a statement of even better performance, and then that you either respond in the positive and it keeps going up, or say you respond in the negative and it goes down, and then it keeps adjusting and calibrating. So that's where you get the adaptive piece of it. And that's really cool. That's like a really, really cool way to measure performance. Another way is just narrative essays. Narrative essays are where, say, your supervisor or your coworker just writes down their thoughts and feelings and perceptions on how you've been performing your job. The problem with essays, much like letters of recommendation, is that they are highly influenced by the person's ability to write, or like effort in writing. So if you have a supervisor who isn't very good at writing, and your performance appraisals get passed up to their supervisor, they're going to effectively project the bad writing of the supervisor onto your performance. And so it's kind of problematic using essays. We're getting better at it if we rely on textual analyses and softwares like Luke that allow us to analyze what key phrases appear, and therefore what aspects of performance are being tapped into. But it's until we really get a more standardized approach to essays, they have probably more problems than they are worth, in my humble opinion as an IO psychologist. So let's talk about these different rating formats and these scales that we can use. How do we actually rate performance? So the one, like I said, that most of you are most familiar with is probably a graphic rating scale. A graphic rating scale is something like what you see here. Of course, this is about an emotion that someone's feeling. This gives you an idea of what it would look like. So here we could, for example, say, in general, does the employee show up to work on time? Or, does the employee show up to work on time? You'd say very slightly or not all, a little bit, moderately, quite a bit, or extremely. And so that's a graphic rating scale. Like I said, it's usually on a 5 to 7, maybe sometimes 10-point Likert scale, and that's what you see down here is a Likert scale. Sometimes there are numbers accompanying these, what we call anchors. Other times there are not. So this is a graphic rating scale. As I said, it's probably the thing that you are most accustomed to seeing. Now, somewhat similar to graphic rating scales, we have behaviorally anchored rating scales. This is where we have a scale that asks about a specific aspect of performance. But because our understanding of what good and not so good performance can be skewed and based on our own biases, then we need to give people a common anchor, a common way to understand what good and not so good performance looks like. So I give an example here. We have a 10-point scale, and the behavior, or rather the activity in question here, is student engagement. So if I were to be, say, assessing your engagement in the class, I could do it using a behaviorally anchored rating scale. So if someone were to say, okay, Dr. Thornton-Lugo, please rate student X's performance in terms of engagement, on a 1 to 10 scale. Well, if I don't know what a 10 looks like and a 1 looks like, it's going to be very hard. Here you can see I've anchored a 1 to mean distracted and inattentive to the professor, a 4 to be occasionally offers insights but otherwise unengaged, a 7 being engages in material but can show sign of disinterest, and 10 being consistently attentive and responsive to professor prompts. So this gives me an idea of what each one would look like and translate into. And this is particularly important and relevant, I think, for the in between, right? We know excellent performance when we see it, and we know bad performance when we see it, but the in between is actually really hard to gauge. And so, in that way, a behaviorally anchored rating scale can really help us accurately assess performance. Okay, so another approach to doing your performance appraisal involves doing a checklist. So you could have a weighted checklist, which is where you list all the behaviors, and each behavior has a different weight, and I'll show an example of that in a second, or a forced choice checklist. So you present two things that, or a bunch of things that even seem all good, and you have to choose one. The great thing about a forced choice checklist is that it enables you to really hone in on what the employee is good at and not just engage in, you know, effectively overrating the employee's performance, just saying, oh, they're good on everything. And we will revisit that when we talk about the biases and the errors that people have in terms of their performance appraisals later. So this is an example of a weighted checklist. I just made this up on my own. This is a weighted checklist that maybe you would have for a university professor. So for faculty performance, you would maybe have delivers engaging lectures, publishes in top tier journals, engages in committee work. These are all things that the person should be doing, and they're weighted accordingly. So delivering lectures is really important, but publishing in top tier journals is even more important, and doing service work, kind of important. Then we get into the things that the person shouldn't be doing. So does not mentor students, frequently absent from office, not producing any academic work. So if the employee is engaging in these things, well, then they would get a negative rating. And so based on what you check, you get a rating based on these weighted scores right here. A forced choice checklist would look something like this. So you would check one of these off. Now we can read all of these and they all sound good, right? Engage in academic and scholarly, and this is once again for a professor, engage in academic and scholarly pursuits outside of those in their field, publishes in top tier journals within their field, prioritizes student achievement and academic engagement, focuses on corporate governance and committee work over all other tasks. Now, you may be reading those and thinking, all of these sound good. How could I possibly decide as a supervisor? Well, that's the thing. You have to decide which of these is most characteristic of your employee. And I can tell you only one of these actually would get you promoted or, academic terms, tenure. And that would be this one right here. And that's the whole point of these checklists is everything is supposed to look good. Everything is supposed to appear good. So you can't just engage in that thing that supervisors sometimes do where they just say, okay, you're good at everything. I'm just going to give you high ratings on everything. So this also really helps us identify what is the person really excelling at relative to other behaviors they could be engaging in. You could also do somewhat similarly in terms of listing things, employee comparisons, and these can go by rank ordering, paired comparisons, or forced distributions. And the goal of this is really to show you, or rather to allow you as a supervisor and as a company potentially to actually directly compare employees. These would be particularly useful for, say, deciding who gets a bonus and who doesn't, or who gets promoted to a position and who doesn't. Some companies do this. So as you saw, or rather heard me say in the Amazon article, Amazon does something similar to this where they rank all of their employees and whoever's at the lowest gets fired. So you could do that as part of your performance appraisal system as well. And in that way, it can be helpful. I do not recommend doing that for the record. But this is one of the ways that you can use employee comparisons in your selection and performance appraisal system. So this is using characters from The Office, which you don't need to know. This is just more to illustrate what it would look like. You can do a rank ordering. So this is where you rank all the employees according to their performance. So let's say I wanted to rank the salespeople of Dunder Mifflin. This is based on my knowledge of the show and evidence that you can find in the show. You would say Dwight is the best salesman, followed by Jim, followed by Stanley, followed by Phyllis, followed by Andy, a later character who we didn't see in the episode we watched. But that's how you could then know, okay, maybe Dwight's the person who gets a raise this year. Maybe Dwight and Jim get raises and no one else does. Or if I'm looking for someone to eventually replace Michael and I want it to be from sales, then I might choose the top salesperson. I might choose Dwight. So that's how rank ordering can be helpful. If you have a selection, or if you have a performance appraisal system and performance management system that relies on knowing how employees stack up and compare to each other, then this kind of approach is useful. Paired comparison is where you actually go through and you compare every person, because sometimes those rank orderings are really hard to do, where you may say, oh, one downside for the record to a rank ordering is this suggests that the performance between differential between Dwight and Andy is quite large. But what if you work at a place where everyone is really good and you're effectively just splitting hairs? Or in some ways, Dwight is better than Jim, and in other ways, Jim is better than Dwight. This really relies also on a holistic assessment of performance. So a rank ordering really doesn't give us a good idea of who's performing well. Or think of Amazon. Amazon is a highly competitive company to get a job at. I imagine that when they fire the lowest ranking employees in their performance assessment system, that they're still firing people who would otherwise be considered to be great employees at other companies. So the problem with this kind of system is it could lead you to lose good talent because you've assumed that a number 5 here means that Andy is not a good salesman. Paired comparisons help you to actually get a direct comparisons between people and to give you an idea of, is there a chance that, in splitting these hairs right here, that we've missed out on some important comparisons between people, that maybe overall Phyllis isn't that good, but when we actually try to stack her up against some other people who are ranked above her, she may come out on top in some way. So we can do direct comparison or paired comparisons. Of course, this can be a lengthy process. I've only illustrated a few of them here because you'd have to do Dwight versus everybody, and then Jim versus Stanley, Phyllis, and Andy, then Stanley versus Phyllis and Andy. You have to go on and on. It could be manageable when you only have 5 employees to compare, but imagine if you had 10 or 20. You couldn't possibly do all those paired comparisons in a timely manner. And so in that way, a paired comparison can be useful for small groups of employees, but probably not for large ones. You can also do a forced distribution. Now, some people even do this in grading in academia. We don't, because you get the grade that you earned, but this also happens in companies where you say, okay, you can only have a certain number of people who are in your top tier. The majority of people in your average area, or the mean, which is statistically what it should be, and then very few people at the bottom end of your distribution. And so in that way, you can force this distribution and say, okay, Dwight's definitely our top salesperson. These are our middle 3, and then Andy's our worst. But once again, what if this is just splitting hairs? Or what if Andy and Dwight, practically speaking, only differ in their sales performances by, say, 5,000 units, which in paper might not be a lot? Then you might this may make it seem like Andy's really underperforming relative to everyone else, when in fact he's doing quite fine and meeting his goals. It's just by virtue of forcing a distribution, it makes it look like he's performing much worse. Another reason that this would be problematic is, once again, if you chose to terminate Andy, or if you chose to promote Dwight over the rest of these people, because you assume that because he's at the top of the distribution, he is truly significantly better than they are. And so this is a problem. It's also a problem in terms of fairness. If I'm Andy and I say, hey, the difference between me and Dwight isn't that great, it's not fair to put me down here or to fire me or not give me a bonus, because though I am lower than everybody else, I'm still doing just fine. Andy may decide, you know what, I don't want to work here anymore, or I'm now going to perform as poorly as you say I do. So there can be some fairness issues related to using a forced distribution. I mean, imagine imagine in this class, if I all of a sudden said, okay, I'm doing a forced distribution, so even if all of you get A minuses to A's, whoever gets the lowest A minus is now getting an F. That happens in some schools and in some classes. So I would stay away from forced distributions. Now, your textbook has a great summary of the pros and cons of these different approaches that I will not belabor. So if you're ever interested in it, go ahead and look there. Okay, so this is the fun stuff. Now we're going to talk about rating processes and errors. So this is where we get to talk about some of the things that you can impress people with your knowledge when it comes to the problems that people have when giving job performance ratings, and ratings of all kinds, and judging everything, really. So when we are engaging in performance appraisal and performance assessment, we engage in the cognitive processing of information. And so there are a number of ways that we can outline what this process is like. Your book focuses on 5. It has observation, encoding, storing, retrieving, and integrating. The order of these can also be somewhat changed, but I will just rely on what your textbook says to avoid that level of confusion. So let's start first with observation. Observation is just that. In order to rate someone's performance, you have to see it in the first place. And so observation is the first step of performance appraisal. But there are issues in our ability to observe without bias and without error. So in observation, as I said, we have a number of biases or a number of factors that can make our perception of things different than that of others. So perceivers have, let me make sure, see if we go a little bit, okay, we don't go into it a little bit more. Perceivers have their own biases as well. So perceivers, for example, can engage in confirmation bias. We all engage in confirmation bias. This is something that every single one of us does. So don't think you're special. We all do it. Confirmation bias is where you look at new information, look at new stimuli, engage with the world in a way that already confirms your preconceived notions and your attitudes and your beliefs. So, for example, a way of engaging in confirmation bias is to, generally speaking, discount things that you don't agree with and only pay attention to the things you do. So, in terms of performance appraisal, if you're a supervisor who already likes an employee, you may be more likely to pay attention to the times that he or she is performing well and not really pay attention to the times when they aren't performing well because it confirms what you already believe in about this employee. Another way that bias can be introduced into observation is by virtue of what you're looking at and who you're looking at and the employee that you're observing and evaluating. So the target in this case, or the employee, and things like novelty, so newness of a behavior, or even just being physically mobile, someone's similarity to you, for example. These things can all influence whether you are likely to give someone a good rating or a bad rating, or influence their, or interpret their behavior in one way or another. For example, related to similarity, and what I said with confirmation, somewhat similar to what I said with confirmation bias, if you like someone, if someone's similar to you, you are more likely to give them good ratings than you would give someone who isn't like you. This is the fundamental process of bias and prejudice against people who don't look like us, don't act like us, don't think like us. And so, in that way, who and what we're looking at can provoke different kinds of biases in our responses. Another thing that can impact our assessments of people's behaviors is the situation. So the time of day can influence how we interpret people's behaviors and how we rate them. The setting, even within work. If you see someone doing something in the break room versus at their desk, you may actually respond and evaluate that behavior differently. And so we have to ask ourselves, to what extent am I bringing my own biases to my observation? To what extent is the person that I'm evaluating provoking biased evaluations from me? And then finally, we have to look at whether the situation is changing how I observe and later interpret behaviors. There are, of course, other biases that can impact our ability to observe. This one is known as selective perception. And I recommend you go, I'll post this in the channel because I know that my video recording for this lecture doesn't do a good job of showing the videos embedded in my slides, but go and look at the video in the channel that I will post. And this shows you what selective perception is. Selective perception is where you only pay attention, either intentionally or unable. Intentionally would be confirmation bias. Unintentionally is when we don't realize what we're missing, that we pay attention to only certain things. And so and I recommend watching the video before I continue what I'm about to say. So I'll wait. Okay. So you only pay attention to what maybe you're told to pay attention to, and because of that, you ignore everything else around you, everything else that could be relevant. And in terms of performance appraisal, this is really important. So let's say, for example, you have one of those checklists and you're using a tablet to go ahead and rate everybody's performance, and you notice, okay, I have to rate on these 5 different behaviors, but because I am focusing on these 5 different behaviors, I may be missing others that are actually still important to make note of. Or similarly, because you're only focusing on, say, certain employees on a certain day, you may miss important pieces of performance for other people. And so sometimes we're not even aware of the things we don't pay attention to. And that's what selective perception gets at. So we just talked about observation. I'm going to combine encoding, storing, and retrieving all in one process. So encoding is sort of where we start to codify the information that we've had, or what we've observed. So that relates to things like schemas, prejudices, stereotypes that we may have. Then we store it. So you have your brain then basically related to encoding, then stores it in according to different information, or rather different cognitive structures that you have. And then retrieval is basically memory. But these processes, all 3 of them, are biased too, because we are cognitive misers. We are pretty lazy when it comes to storing information and interpreting it and remembering it. This is why movies where they talk about, and for the record, this is an adaptive process. Your brain couldn't hold on to every piece of information as if it were its own unique snowflake. You would go literally insane. And so it's a blessing and a curse that our brains do this, that we analyze and interpret and store information based on categories, based on similarities, based on connections. And the curse, of course, being, though, that we therefore rely on schemas and stereotypes to engage in the world. So schemas are mental representations of a thing. You can have a schema for professor. You can have a schema for behaviors you should engage in when you go to a coffee shop. You can have a schema for the role of student. You can have schemas for anything, but a schema is a cognitive representation of a thing. We've been developing schemas since we were born, if not before. The human brain is very complex, both in and outside of the uterus, but we have been developing schemas for our understanding of what the world is, at least from birth. And so what that means is that our concept of things and our concept and understanding of them is always based on the information and the knowledge that we've already had. And Piaget has a lot of really good descriptions and explanations of how our schemas about different things evolve over time and how they change, right? So when you're a baby and a child, you have a schema for animal. And your concept of an animal continues to change as you learn more about different animals and what's included in that schema. And then within that schema, you start to develop related schema, like I have a schema for animal, but then I have a distinct schema for dog. And then as you learn more about the world, you might say, okay, well, I have a schema for canine. And then you start to develop a different schema for wolf versus domestic dog. And so that just represents how over time, the information that we generate can develop into different schemas, but it's always based on the information and therefore the schemas that we've already developed. We're always adapting our schemas based on the new information. And that way our schemas act as an anchor in some ways. We're always adapting that schema to take into account the new information, but it's not like the new information is treated as its own unique thing that we don't try to make fit into a category that we already have. So schemas are a blessing and a curse. One type of schema, or one basically like manifestation of schemas, are stereotypes. We do have stereotypes for people and for things too, I guess, and animals, but we can focus on the ones that we have for people. Now, stereotypes are, as I said, a kind of schema. They are a mental representation of someone. Usually it's based on a group or a role or something that we know about them. A group or a role they occupy or something we know about them. Stereotypes aren't necessarily inherently bad, right? So we can think of quote unquote good stereotypes. So if I'm a hiring manager, I might say to myself, well, I want to hire someone for an HR position who has an HR degree because I believe that people with HR degrees probably make better HR managers. That is a stereotype, the idea that someone with an HR degree would make a good HR manager or would have the knowledge to be an HR manager. It seems like that's inoffensive. And in that way, it is a quote unquote good or maybe benign stereotype, if you will. And stereotypes like that help us make decisions. They help us understand the world. They help us understand information. That if I know someone's an HR man or an HR has an HR degree, I can make some reasonable conclusions about them. The problem is when stereotypes lead us to inaccurate judgments or judgments that are problematic. Those can be bad. So if you have a stereotype that nurses should only be women, that may lead you to make some erroneous hiring decisions. It may lead you to make some prejudiced decisions that will get your company sued. And it's also grounded in sexism, which is a huge problem. So stereotypes aren't inherently bad if they're based on reasonable information and don't lead you to make prejudiced or racist, sexist, etc. decisions. But when they lead you down those paths to where you're making poor decisions, erroneous decisions, decisions based on characteristics that don't actually have a bearing on someone's performance or ability to do a job, that's when they become a problem. So I want to make it very clear. Some stereotypes are bad. Some stereotypes are just a byproduct of human functioning and help us navigate the world. But be very careful to not confuse the two. So last one is integration. Integration is where we put all of our information together and try to basically make sense of things, understand it, make it applicable to our world. So one way that we can do this is by making attributions for behaviors. This is just one process that we do that relates to integration. It does not represent the whole of integration. And for the record, attribution theory does not appear in your book. So this is something that I am introducing that is not in your book. So I'm not saying pay attention, just saying it's not in your book. So attribution theory relates to the fact that when we see a behavior, we tend to give it a cause. Human beings are always trying to give causes to things, to understand our world, to make sense of everything. So this is one thing that we do. I see someone behaving a certain way, and I may ask myself, why did they do that? Why did they behave that way? According to attribution theory, we basically rely on 3 criteria to judge. And for the record, our causes generally go into, did the person engage in the behavior because of something internal to themselves, or did they engage in the behavior because of something external to themselves? So we basically see a behavior and give it an internal or an external cause. The way we go about deciding whether something has an internal or an external cause is we look at 3 criteria: distinctiveness, consensus, and consistency. Is the behavior distinctive? Have we seen the person engage in it in other situations? Is there consensus? Have we seen other people engage in that behavior in the same situation or under the same conditions? And then is there consistency? Do we see the person responding similarly to other stimuli in this way? So not necessarily have we seen it before, but do we see them doing this across multiple current situations? So if I see an employee maybe watching a video, I'd ask myself, well, have I seen this before? Are other employees watching videos? And is this person continuing to watch videos throughout the day or in different situations that I'm observing right here and right now? So then you make an internal or external attribution. You decide, okay, does this behavior represent something that I believe is coming from within the person? So they are the cause of it. It's either because so let's talk about the video example. It's because this employee is a bad employee. They're not good at their job. They're lazy. They don't care to be engaged. Those are all things internal to the person. So I could make that conclusion about the choice to watch a video, or I could conclude that it's an external cause. So it's break time. Everyone's doing it. If everyone else is doing it, they're only doing it on break time, then it's because of the situation and the timing of the day, and not necessarily something about the employee themselves. And this is important when it comes to performance evaluation, right? Because I may be more interested, or rather I may care to actually, make a distinction between observing an employee watching a video when they are doing it because they're not engaged and they're a bad worker, versus, oh, they're watching a video while on their break. And these attributions that we make, once again, influence what appears in our performance reviews and appraisals, and what we ding our employees on and what we don't ding them on. So That's attribution theory in a nutshell. And what it is basically doing is it's showing us, they're giving you an illustration of some of the ways we may integrate and attempt to give meaning to the information that we perceive and the information that we have and the information that we've encoded. But even this process is not without its own biases. So we have the fundamental attribution error and the self-serving bias. The fundamental attribution error is where we are more likely to attribute others' behaviors to internal versus external causes. So what this means is that if I see an employee doing what I mentioned earlier, that he or she is actually watching a video at work, I am far more likely to assume that the reason that the person is doing that is because they are a lazy worker, or they are bad at their job, or they are not engaged. Any number of internal attributions. I am far less likely to effectively give him or her the benefit of the doubt, to assume that the reason they're doing it is because they are on a break, or because maybe they're having a really hard day. They just found out that, their family member is sick, and so they're looking for some sort of temporary release just to get through the workday. So, like I said, fundamental attribution error means that when we're integrating information and attempting to understand it, we more often than not assume that the reason people do things is because of who they are and not because of the situation they are in. The flip side of it is we do not do the same thing for ourselves. So when we are giving meaning or explanation to our own behaviors, and this is relevant for our performance evaluations of our own behaviors, we are far more likely to say that the reason you've done something, especially something that's undesirable, is because of the situation. So if my supervisor catches me, if Dr. Paul Levy catches me watching a video on YouTube at my desk on my phone, I'm more likely to say, oh, well, I was doing it because of the situation. I've had a really hard day. It was really just a tough day. I was just doing it to get it through. Whereas I might not give other people the benefit of that doubt. And so I might be more likely to attribute my undesirable behaviors to, as I said, external causes, to things outside of me. I'm not going to say, oh, the reason I was watching a video is because I'm a bad employee or I don't know how to do my job, right? So that's the self-serving bias. The flip side of it too, interestingly enough, is that we are far more likely to attribute our good behaviors and the good things we do to ourselves. So you may see this in your own attributions for your performance in various classes. You may say, oh, I got an A because I know my stuff and I'm smart. I get IO psychology. But let's say you do poorly on a quiz. One quiz, you may say, Dr. Thornton-Lugo makes really hard quizzes. I know my stuff, but she just has unreasonable expectations. Or I had a really rough day and I had a really rough night, and that's why I didn't do well on my quiz. It's just because it was a really hard time, not because maybe you don't know your stuff. And so that's what happens. That's the self-serving bias. Good things we do, we say it's because of who we are. Bad things we do, or not so good things we do, we say it's because of the situation. So there are other issues and biases in rating performance, and I'm going to go through these here. Most of these I think are in your book too, so you're welcome to go there. Halo error, halo bias, halo error is what most IO psychologists call it, is when you rely on your general perception of something to guide your evaluation of specific dimensions of performance. And like I said, it's usually performance. So for example, let's say you're a manager and you're in charge of evaluating your employees, and you have all of these specific questions and criteria that you need to ask yourself about this employee's performance. But what happens with Halo is that instead of going through each item and considering it individually, considering, does this employee do this? Does this employee do that? You just rely on your general impression of the employee's performance to guide your answers to all those questions. So let's say overall you think the employee is a good employee, but you have 10 different questions about, do they show up on time? Do they engage well with clients? Do they interact well with peers, et cetera, et cetera? And you may say, well, this person's a good employee, so I'm going to give him, her, them 4 out of 5 on all of these because I know they're a good employee. Of course, the flip side of this does happen with negative perceptions and negative evaluations of employees, but let's focus on the positive ones. The problem with this is you could theoretically have a good employee who does not come into work on time every day. And so you are, in that way, not giving an accurate assessment of their performance because let's say you just say, oh, they're a good employee, they must come in early every day, or you just ignore the nature of the question entirely. You're losing out on valuable information and therefore valuable feedback you could give the employee to improve. So that's what halo is. Basically, you rely on your general perception of a person to influence specific ratings of that person. It's not a good thing. We want to avoid it. Of course, I should say, and I don't think we get to this. Of course, I should say that there's one question, this comes up in your book, about whether halo is true correlation or whether it's an error, because we would expect, though, the good employees to generally be good on everything. So this is the really hard part about halo error, is that we're not, it's really hard to basically disentangle, am I rating this person highly because they do genuinely do well on everything, or am I rating them highly or poorly, because it goes both ways, highly or poorly because they, are, I'm just relying on my general perception of them. So that's what halo is. Leniency is when you tend to give good ratings across all people and across all dimensions. And so this is obviously related to halo, but we would usually be referring to this when you're doing it across multiple people. So when you are the kind of rater who gives people 5s out of 5s on everything, or even if you're not getting 5s out of 5s relative to your peers and other raters, you generally give better ratings than other people. So that's leniency. The reason we bring up things like leniency and central tendency and severity, which follow, is because we need to understand and calibrate a person's ratings to their tendencies to, say, be lenient or be severe. Because we may then need to understand, okay, if everybody is getting, average ratings between 3 and 5, well, I need to know the difference then. If Professor Thornton-Lugo is giving everybody a rating of 3 out of 5 or above, then I need to interpret that as, okay, the person who's getting a 3 out of 5 needs to be seen as significantly and meaningfully lower than the person who's getting a 5 out of 5. So understanding the biases that people have in their ratings also helps us interpret their ratings in a practical and meaningful way. Similarly, with central tendency, this is where you get people who tend to just give average ratings. So they're always rating down the middle. For the record, I have to say that this is central leniency, central tendency, and severity are not intentional. This isn't equivalent to someone who, say, goes through a survey and just says, okay, I'm going to go down the middle because I don't care, right? This is someone who genuinely and sincerely just finds everybody to be average in their ratings. So those are two different things. What we're talking about here is the genuine and sincere rating that ultimately still results in everybody being rated above average or about average, around the average of a scale. That's central tendency. Severity, on the other hand, is the opposite of leniency. It's someone who is consistently harsh in their evaluations of a person. So they're always rating them at the lower end of the scale. These things are also important to be aware of, especially severity and leniency, because let's imagine that you were trying to decide to promote from within 3 different units, and each of those units has a manager who has a different bias in their ratings. These managers, it would not be fair to say compare the ratings of a person who works for a manager who engages in a lot of leniency with someone whose manager engages in a lot of severity in their ratings. And so that's why it's important to be aware of these biases and to maybe compare people and calibrate them, compare people against their own ratings, or make an assessment based on the average of the supervisor's rating rather than their absolute ratings of the person. So in short, the reason we need to be aware of these biases is so we can accurately interpret people's ratings if they are engaging in these biases. Because as I said, it's not fair to really compare the ratings of someone who's been rated by a lenient supervisor with the ratings of someone who has been rated by a severe supervisor. There are also some things that can impact our performance evaluations. One of these things is the recency effect. The recency effect is where you tend to overweight or consider information or things that have happened that are recent more strongly than you do things that are far in the past. So, for example, when it comes to performance evaluations, your supervisors are probably going to rely, unless they've been taking detailed notes about your performance every week, they're going to rely on their most recent observations of your performance and your most recent activities. And you may say, that's fine, I'm generally a good employee, but let's imagine that your supervisor rates you the weekend that your girlfriend broke up with you, or rates you the week after your girlfriend broke up with you, or rates you the week that you just found out that a loved one has been diagnosed with a terminal illness. So you may say to yourself, okay, well, now that I know that, I absolutely do not want my supervisor to be rating me just on what recently happened. So in that way, we need to be aware as potential supervisors and raters of people's performance that the things that happened most recently are those that are going to impact us the most. And so we just need to be potentially constantly taking notes about performance or having a performance appraisal system that happens more frequently rather than, say, once a year. Another effect that can influence performance appraisals is not necessarily the opposite of recency, but it's somewhat akin to the opposite of recency. It's primacy. It gets at the idea that first impressions matter. So if you're a new employee, the things that you do at first and your performance at first is going to influence what people think about you for the rest of your employment. So that's why it's important to show up looking well dressed on your first day and to do your best in the first couple of weeks, because when it comes to your performance evaluation, be it a few months or even a year later, people are still going to remember what they first knew about you. This almost gets at that idea of schemas that we mentioned earlier in stereotypes to some extent, but schemas that my schema as a supervisor surrounding my new employee is strongly influenced and impacted by the first things I learn about them. Because after I've established that initial schema, everything that I learn about that person afterwards is going to be incorporated into it. And it's much harder to change an existing schema based on new information. It's far less likelier to change. What you're more likely to do is change your interpretation of the new information to fit your schema. So let's think of it this way. You start a job and you just have a real bad go at it for the first 2 weeks. Well, your supervisor now thinks, okay, this employee A is just a bad worker. And so that's the schema, that's the impression they have of you. And so for the rest of your time there, your supervisor has it in their head, this person is not a good employee. And so every time that they get new information that suggests otherwise, what they're trying to change is the idea that you're not a good employee. And that idea is much harder to change. What they're more likely to do is say, oh, well, that was a one-off. Them landing that big client was a one-off. Maybe I'll remember that, but I still think overall they aren't a good employee. And related to confirmation bias, they're also going to be paying attention to information that confirms that schema, that you are a bad employee. So that's why first impressions matter. And in your first few weeks to a month at work, you need to be doing really, really well. The last issue and bias that can impact performance ratings is similarity. And we've already discussed it, so I won't belabor the point. But with similarity, what we find is that we do tend to give ratings to people who are similar, or do tend to give better ratings to people who are similar to us compared to those who are dissimilar. Of course, it depends on what we are focusing on in terms of similarity, and this can include things like someone who graduated, in your case, someone who graduated from the University of Akron. You're probably more likely to give that person a better rating than you are somebody who graduated from Kent State. Or as a woman, you're probably more likely to give better ratings to other women. So it depends on what nature of similarity you are looking at and what you're focusing on. But that's why one of the many reasons the gender pay gap exists and why women don't get as good performance ratings as men do from their male supervisors, and that people of color don't get as good ratings from their white superiors. And so these are things that we just need to be aware of. We have to be careful not to overcorrect. We just have to be careful to be accurate and to avoid our tendencies to just rate the people who are like us better. So, How can we make this better? How can we avoid these? If you're sitting here thinking, this is terrifying, I don't want to work for an organization that does these things, well, train your raters. It's as simple as that, though there are problems with training your raters. But if you want to really attempt to avoid it, you got to train people. So one way that you can do this is through rater error training. You train your raters. I should change this. It should say train them on the errors, not train them on the raters. Train them on the errors right here. And you train them by virtue of training them. So even by me, by virtue of teaching you right now what the errors are, you are far more likely to avoid them in the future. Of course, assuming you're motivated, which I think we'll talk about in a second, but this assumes that you're motivated to actually be an accurate rater. But training is one way. So training people on the raters, rating errors, teaching them about what halo error is and what leniency is and severity is. The next one is frame of reference training. So this is really important because, once again, getting to things like leniency and severity, we want to have a calibration on performance because leniency and severity can result not only in a person's tendency to just be critical, well, just from a person's tendency to be critical, to think that there aren't ever good levels of performance, but if you start to teach them, okay, this is what good performance looks like. Here's what a 5 out of 5 looks like. Here's what a 3 out of 5 looks like. Here's what a 1 out of 5 looks like. Getting back to the bars that I showed you earlier, these things can help calibrate people as well. Because I may say to myself, oh, I thought a 5 out of 5 looked like this, but you're telling me it looks like that. Okay, well, now at least we all have the same frame of reference. And now we can, going back to my example about comparing employees from different managers and different groups, we can then make more meaningful comparisons across our employees. This is also similar to behavioral observation training. This is discussed in your book, so I won't go too much more into it, but it's just about observing behaviors and making sure we understand and interpret those behaviors in a similar way as raters. Now, this actually gets to the thing I mentioned earlier, goals and accountability. You do have to establish goals for your raters and get them to be on board with the whole purpose of their rating training and their rating in general. So you have to establish explicit goals for your raters. This can be a goal of accuracy. So you have to say, hey, everyone, you have to be accurate. This is our goal. Accuracy is our goal. And you have to make sure, of course, they buy into it. Another corresponding goal that you could have is fairness. Are your raters determined to be fair, and accuracy is obviously related to fairness. You can't be fair unless you're accurate. So we have to set and establish these goals for our raters and get them to buy into them in order for them to accept and engage in their training, but also apply their training to their eventual ratings of behaviors and performance. Another way that you can ensure that your raters actually aim for these things like accuracy and fairness is you establish a channel of accountability. So you establish a feedback mechanism for the feedback. And in that way, if raters know that they are going to have to be accountable for their ratings, either to a supervisor or to the employee themselves, then they are far more likely to be accurate. Now let's talk about context. As I mentioned earlier, in terms of the information processing system that we have in our brains, context matters. Context influences how we interpret information. So reactions, how an employee feels is really important. How an employee reacts to appraisal can influence the effectiveness of that appraisal in actually creating change. And it can also affect an employee's performance in the future. So an employee's reactions to a rater, so in this case, like the manager or the supervisor, their reactions of favorability, so that the extent to which they positively respond to a rating system can influence their adequate engagement in it and their ability to use it. It's also critical that your raters, once again, the supervisors and the managers, feel that the system is effective. You can very well imagine a disillusioned manager who says, why am I even bothering rating people's performance? It doesn't make a difference. Bad employees stick around and good ones just get a job elsewhere. So I don't care. I'm not going to try. So something to consider, that your raters have to be on board as well. Another thing that we need to be considerate of is the ratee's action, so the person being rated, because they also are concerned with things like fairness and accuracy, as we mentioned before. They want to be sure that their ratings are fair. We believe in a principle of equity, and we will revisit this when we talk about organizational justice, but we believe that our assessments and our rewards should be proportional to the performance that we put forth. And if we believe that something is inaccurate or not accurately capturing our performance, we will react negatively. These things, for the record, have been considered to be neglected criteria. So we're often looking at things like, are the performance evaluations accurate, and are they predicting future performance? Are they leading to lower rates of turnover, identifying good promotion choices, etc.? These things don't get evaluated enough because we usually don't see them as having any tangible reason to be concerned with, or we don't see them as having any tangible impact on our organization, and therefore we don't need to pay attention to them. But the extent to which everybody involved, your stakeholders in your performance management system, buy into that system, the better it will work. The better people will react to the system and engage with it. Because I think I talk about it, just want to make sure. Some people, if they don't believe it's working well, will just discount it. They won't pay attention. If they think that the system is broken, or the system doesn't matter, or that it's ineffective, then your employees aren't going to perform better. So in that way, we do need to pay attention to reactions, because they can impact subsequent performance and people's happiness with working in the organization. Of course, there are some people who react well to the feedback and performance appraisal that they get, and others that don't. The reason we need to be aware of this, whether people actually enjoy their performance feedback or don't, is that it's also really easy when you're angry or upset with a performance appraisal to discount it. And so we want to avoid, to the extent possible, giving our employees reasons to be unhappy with their performance appraisal. So we want it to be accurate. And of course, no one likes getting bad feedback. No one really likes being told they aren't doing their job well. But if you do it in a fair manner, in a reasonable manner, and there are a lot of techniques for how you can do this in a way that people will be receptive to their feedback, then we can actually get employees on board with, say, making positive changes and improving their performance, and therefore improving our organization. So one thing related to this, I think this is the last point on it. Yeah. The last point on receptiveness to feedback relates to the Dunning-Kruger effect. The opposite of the Dunning-Kruger effect, if you will, if there is an opposite, is imposter syndrome, which I think is something more people are familiar with now. But let's first talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is this idea, and it's been pretty well supported in the research, that the people who need the most improvement, the people who are lowest in terms of ability and execution of things, are the people who feel they are least in need of improvement. I'm trying to use the least editorialized version of the Dunning-Kruger effect, because some people will use it to explain effectively lack of intelligence, which is valid. But for the case of in the case of dealing with workers, what this means is that your employees, who are the lowest performers and the ones most in need of feedback and performance improvement, are those that are least likely to feel that they need it. One of the potential explanations for this is that, and this relates to somewhat of, I think, what I told you all earlier with regard to research methods and whatnot, and just the value of science, though I could be wrong, and is that people who are experts know how much they don't know. And people who are good at things know how much they can improve. People who aren't good at things and aren't experts in a real sense don't know how little they know or how much they can improve. So this is effectively a conundrum of the Dunning-Kruger effect, is that how do you get the people who need to improve the most to improve if they are highly unlikely to ever believe that they need to be improved in the first place? As I said, the opposite of this is, or the opposite, a corollary in the opposite direction is the imposter syndrome, which is where people feel consistently that they don't measure up, that they are an imposter, that they, in spite of developing expertise, in spite of being experts in their field and in their domain, and in the case of your employees, in spite of being really good at their job, they often feel like they aren't good at their job, or that they're just not quite that good, or maybe they've always been faking it all along, and one day someone's going to find them out. So we find evidence for both of these, but the point is here, when it comes to performance feedback in an organization, you may find yourself beating your head against your desk wondering, why is it that my worst performing employees don't see the need to perform better, or rather don't see that they are in need of improvement? This also happens with things like emotional intelligence. People who are the lowest in emotional intelligence are the least likely to feel like they need to be educated or developed on emotional intelligence. We'll talk about this with motivation too, but there are people who believe that, you can't learn to be better as well. They believe that you are the way you are and there's really nothing you can do to improve. So all of these things can frustrate your ability to improve your employees, to get them to listen to feedback, to leverage your performance appraisal system to do what it's supposed to do. Identify good employees and promote them, but also identify those who aren't as good and help them develop. Another thing that can influence the performance evaluation in your organization is politics. Now, Longnecker has this amazing article from 1987, I think, about this, and he interviewed managers and supervisors and people who were responsible for giving performance evaluations. And he asked them, what factors go into your performance evaluations? What things are you considering when you are giving performance evaluations? And so this gets into the concept of politics, where people use performance evaluations in the performance evaluation system to impact who has power, who gets promoted, who gets fired, and whatnot. And so Longnecker found, more specifically to the aspect of performance evaluation, that people considered a lot of different factors when giving their performance evaluation, factors that we probably wouldn't want considered in our ratings. Things like, are people getting bonuses this year? And if only a few people are getting bonuses, should I maybe be more harsh in my ratings of people? Should I really only then try to give better ratings to the people that I like? Another thing that people consider is the home life of the person they are evaluating. If they knew, for example, that the person's spouse or child had just been diagnosed with cancer and that this was the only way this person had health insurance, they would be less likely to evaluate them poorly so they wouldn't lose their job. Another more sinister thing that can happen is that people can use performance evaluations, as we somewhat saw in our discussion of Amazon, to push people out that they don't like, to push people either out of the organization that they don't like, or less sinisterly, push people maybe out of their unit and into another. And then finally, Longnecker found that people also considered whether they thought, back to our earlier point, the performance appraisal system actually did anything, or whether other people took it seriously. So if you don't think other people take it seriously, and you don't think that it has actual meaning, then you're far less likely to give accurate performance ratings. So the whole point here is that there are so many factors that go into performance appraisal, and we need to make sure that they don't. Of course, we would love the generosity of a supervisor who knows that one of our children has just been diagnosed with cancer and won't, on the heels of that, fire me or fire us because, we want to still have a job. But the problem with that is then it could negatively impact other people? What if there is someone who's performing better than you, objectively speaking, and they lose their job? Is that fair to them to lose their job because you got a higher performance rating because your child had cancer, not because you were actually the better performing employee? Imagine you were the person who got fired. Imagine we're at Amazon and you have a lowest 5% or lowest 10% get fired every year. Imagine that you are now among that 10 or 5% because your supervisor decided to give the person with the sick spouse or the sick kid a better rating, and only for that reason. You would think that's total BS. And so, in that way, while politics may seem like they are adjusting for injustice and they are helping people, it can actually be quite destructive. And so, that's why we really need to ensure that our ratings are accurate and that they are reflecting only performance. Now, one last thing. I'm going to post a couple of these articles because there are some on the channel, I should say, because there are some current challenges to performance evaluation. The most recent of which is how do we evaluate how do we evaluate performance in a time of telework? And Dr. Levy in his textbook was very prescient in including this because it's a huge issue now. How do we evaluate performance when people are working at home? My supervisor, Dr. Levy, can't actually come down the hallway and see if I'm doing my job. And in fact, we may be limited in a lot of the peer observation of teaching that goes on. In fact, I'm fairly confident that at some point someone's going to sit in on this class and watch what I do with you all, zoom in, and that's very different than being face to face. But that presents a really big challenge for the ability of managers and organizations to evaluate their employees' performance. And so because of this, we have to switch our considerations in performance evaluation. Now, the NYT article, I'm going to, as I said, post it in the channel. It gives a lot of insight into the challenges and the potential benefits of working from home. It's a pretty measured piece. It's not really critical per se 100% on working from home, but it gives a lot of good insights. The other question is, how can we then measure it ethically? Not only how can we measure performance accurately when we're doing telework, but ethically. Because we could imagine a world in which we could measure it accurately by virtue of doing surveillance. We've talked about this in this class before. But the downside to that is that then your employees feel like they're living in 1984, the book, not the year, that they're living under the watchful eye of Big Brother and that they can't have real true freedom and autonomy. We talked about this in our research methods class, that if you feel like you have autonomy, you are far more likely to be motivated and to function better as a human being. But if you feel like your autonomy has been robbed of you because your supervisor is always looking over your shoulder, be it virtually or actually, then that can really negatively impact people. Also, in terms of the ethics of it, is it really appropriate to monitor every single moment of every single day of your employees, especially when we're working at home and the lines between work hours and non-work hours is very, very blurry. So in that way, we have to ask ourselves, how can we measure it both accurately and ethically? Another current challenge is the idea, and you see so many, sorry, just making sure I'm not missing anything. You see so many think pieces come out that seem intuitively appealing that relate to getting rid of the performance review. And they'll tell you about how the performance review brings such stress and anxiety to people, and that it results in bias and adverse impact against marginalized groups, and that the only way we can possibly help people and help the suffering employee and the people who are discriminated against is to get rid of the performance review. The reason you can pick up on my sarcasm in my voice is this is a well-meaning but overall exceedingly stupid idea. And the reason that I say this is because given our current legal system, the only way that you can prove, at least if we're focusing on discrimination, bias, those kinds of things that we don't want organizations to be doing against protected groups, the only way that you can prove that an organization is engaging in that is you do have to have performance reviews. You do have to show like, hey, they are mathematically, we can document them not doing the performance review, or them doing the performance reviews in a way that consistently is biased against people of color, consistently biased against women. I know I mentioned earlier that having performance reviews does protect an organization against lawsuits, and it does. But part of also proving adverse impact and discrimination in a performance appraisal system relies on mathematical metrics of it as well. So you could theoretically envision a world in which you have a company that doesn't do performance appraisals, and it results in discrimination. And the company could say, hey, we do this to avoid discrimination. We do this system to avoid the adverse impact and the discrimination that happens against people of color. And so we don't rely on mathematical models, and we don't rely on the, you know, bars and Likert scales that people use to evaluate performance. You know, we don't even rely on a checklist or a forced comparison. But without that data, it actually can potentially limit your ability to successfully leverage a case of discrimination against an employer or a case of adverse impact. Now, in terms of and we'll revisit this when we talk about the legal procedures for dealing with a case of adverse impact or bias and discrimination in the workplace. But you could feasibly think of a company getting away with arguing that because they got rid of a specific aspect of their performance appraisal system, or they got rid of their performance appraisal system, that they aren't engaging in bias because they've gotten rid of the thing that leads to the bias in the first place. So it actually benefits a lot of people, both the organization and the employee, to have a performance appraisal system. It is in some ways a necessary evil. I'm not sitting here saying that performance appraisal is always a good thing, but it is a tool that, once taken away, can actually lead to more harm than potentially good. Now, so the solution here is not necessarily to get rid of the performance review, because it serves a critical purpose for both organizations and employees, but the goal is to maybe make it better. And the book offers a lot of suggestions on how to do that, on how to make a performance appraisal system that works. In the this article that one of the articles I'm going to post, I think from NPR or the New York Times, about getting rid of the performance review, really shows how you can maybe do it better, how you can do performance reviews better in a way that don't make people miserable and don't result in bias, but still provide useful feedback and can still help all parties involved when it comes to legal claims of discrimination and bias. Now, this isn't covered here, but there are some things in the text that I didn't go over because I just didn't want to belabor the point. We talked about, there are some other facets of the social context we didn't talk about, providing performance feedback, and then some legal issues related to wearables. So feel free to go over those. Like I said, it's not covered here just because I don't want to belabor every point in the textbook, but it is in the text. There are some things, of course, here that are not in the textbooks, so I would also pay attention to those. So that's it. Thank you all, and I will see you in the activity on Thursday.